The most dangerous flood is the one that arrives long before the rain does. By the time I realized someone had turned the water against my family, it was already swallowing the eastern pasture of my ranch one muddy wave at a time. My name is Marcus Holloway, and I own a $6 million ranch just outside a growing Texas subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. My grandfather cleared this land with little more than determination. My father spent his entire life protecting it, and I believed I would someday pass it to my own children exactly as I received it. That morning, however, the familiar landscape looked like something I barely recognized. Cold brown water stretched across fields where my horses usually grazed. Fence posts leaned beneath the pressure of the current. The smell of soaked earth mixed with broken grass filled the cool morning air, while distant thunder rolled across a sky that was already beginning to clear. Storms had crossed this valley for generations, but they had never left my ranch looking like this. I climbed into my pickup and drove slowly toward the eastern boundary, where the flooding appeared deepest. The tires pushed through several inches of muddy water before I stopped beside a section of fence that should have been completely dry. Something bright caught my attention near the gate. Resting against the wire was a weathered red survey stake, half buried in silt, its faded paint still visible beneath the mud. I picked it up without thinking much about it, brushed away the dirt with my glove, and tossed it into the bed of my truck. At the time, it looked like nothing more than construction debris carried by the flood. I had no idea that small piece of wood would eventually become the most important object in the entire story. Looking uphill, I noticed something that unsettled me far more than the rising water. Every home inside Willow Creek Estates stood perfectly dry. Their freshly landscaped yards looked untouched. Decorative ponds reflected the morning sunlight without overflowing. Newly planted trees stood neatly in place, while my pasture continued disappearing beneath muddy runoff. Then I saw her. Victoria Ashcroft, the president of the Homeowners Association, stood near the subdivision entrance holding a cup of coffee as calmly as if she were watching an ordinary spring morning. She looked across the flooded pasture, noticed me standing beside my truck, and offered a polite wave before turning back toward the neighborhood. There was something about that moment I could not explain. It was not what she did. It was how completely unsurprised she seemed by what had happened. I spent the rest of the day moving equipment to higher ground, checking every section of damaged fencing and making sure the livestock remained safe. Even while working, one question refused to leave my mind. Why had the water chosen only my land? The weather report called it another seasonal storm, but I had lived on this ranch my entire life. Rain followed gravity, and gravity followed the land. If the water had reached my pasture in a way I had never seen before, then something about the land itself had changed. What I did not know was that the answer had been patiently waiting for years, hidden beneath fresh construction, quiet meetings, friendly smiles, and a plan that depended on me believing this flood was nothing more than bad luck. I spent that evening sitting on the wide front porch of the ranch house, watching the last streaks of orange sunlight fade behind the oak trees while the floodwater slowly reflected the darkening sky. The sound of frogs and crickets had returned, but something about the land felt strangely unfamiliar, as though it was trying to tell me a story I had not learned how to hear yet. My grandfather used to say that land remembers every footprint, every storm, and every promise made upon it. As a boy, I thought he was simply speaking like an old rancher. As an adult, I understood he was talking about responsibility. This ranch had never been just another piece of real estate. It was the place where my grandfather built a small wooden cabin after returning from military service, where my father expanded the cattle operation one fence line at a time, and where I learned before I was 10 years old that sunrise always arrived long before comfort. Every weathered board in the barn, every live oak casting shade across the pasture, and every winding trail carried memories that no appraisal could ever calculate. Local brokers often described the property as worth $6 million because of its location beside one of the fastest-growing developments in the county, but to my family, its true value had never been measured in money. It represented decades of sacrifice that could never be replaced once it disappeared. That was exactly why the offers kept coming. The first purchase proposal had arrived nearly 3 years earlier, shortly after Willow Creek Estates announced plans for another phase of expansion. It was respectful, generous, and professionally written. I declined without hesitation. Then another offer arrived several months later with a higher number. After that came representatives from investment companies, commercial developers, and attorneys who all seemed remarkably interested in the exact same piece of land. Every conversation followed a familiar pattern. They praised the ranch, complimented my family's hard work, explained how much easier life could become if I accepted their proposal, and politely smiled when I refused. None of them appeared angry. None of them argued. They simply thanked me for my time before promising they would check again in the future. Looking back, I realized every one of those meetings had quietly revolved around the same assumption. Eventually, I would change my mind. Standing beside the flooded pasture that morning, I finally understood why they believed patience would eventually work in their favor. A ranch damaged by floodwater loses more than healthy grass. Repairs become expensive. Livestock operations slow down. Insurance questions begin. Every week of uncertainty creates another reason to consider selling. It was a strategy that might have succeeded against someone who viewed the property as an investment instead of a family legacy. But every time I looked across those fields, I still saw my father teaching me how to mend a fence after a storm and my grandfather reminding me that people never truly own the land. They simply protect it until the next generation is ready. As darkness settled across the pasture, my eyes drifted once more toward the bed of my pickup, where the weathered red survey stake rested exactly where I had tossed it that morning. For reasons I still could not explain, I had the growing feeling that the little piece of wood knew far more about the flood than anyone inside Willow Creek Estates was willing to admit. Victoria Ashcroft understood something that many people never did. If you smiled while asking for another person's property, most people would mistake ambition for kindness. The first time she introduced herself, she arrived at my ranch carrying a homemade peach pie and wearing the kind of friendly smile that immediately put new neighbors at ease. She complimented my horses, admired the old cedar barn, and spent nearly half an hour asking thoughtful questions about ranch life, as though she genuinely respected everything my family had built. Before leaving, she casually mentioned that Willow Creek Estates hoped to continue expanding over the next few years and wondered whether I had ever considered selling. I thanked her for stopping by and told her the same thing my father always said whenever someone asked that question. This ranch was never on the market. Victoria laughed softly, wished me a pleasant afternoon, and drove away in a spotless white sport utility vehicle that disappeared around the subdivision entrance. I believed that conversation had settled the matter. Instead, it quietly became the beginning of a campaign that lasted for years. Every few months, another purchase offer arrived. Sometimes it came through a respected real estate brokerage. Other times it arrived from attorneys representing investment partnerships or development companies eager to acquire land near the growing subdivision. Each proposal offered more money than the one before it. Each letter praised the location, the acreage, and the opportunity to secure my family's financial future. Every answer I gave remained exactly the same. Money could replace buildings, equipment, and livestock. It could never replace 3 generations of memories rooted in the same soil. As time passed, the conversation slowly changed. Friendly offers became persistent inquiries. Persistent inquiries became carefully worded letters suggesting that future development might affect the surrounding area. At homeowners association meetings, Victoria often spoke about protecting property values, responsible planning, and building a stronger community for future residents. Her words sounded reasonable, and most people nodded in agreement because nothing she said appeared hostile. What almost nobody noticed was that every presentation included maps showing future expansion stopping precisely at the edge of my ranch. Without my property, Willow Creek Estates remained unfinished. With it, the entire development could connect into one continuous neighborhood, dramatically increasing its value. That realization explained why every conversation eventually circled back to my land. Construction crews also became increasingly active near my eastern property line. Surveyors placed bright red stakes into the ground before engineers arrived with measuring equipment and heavy machinery. Small sections of open drainage gradually disappeared beneath fresh grading, decorative landscaping, and newly installed retaining walls. To most people, those improvements simply made the subdivision look more attractive. To someone who had spent a lifetime watching rain cross the same fields, the landscape no longer behaved the way I remembered. My father always said that the land whispers before it ever starts shouting. Looking back across those years, I realized every survey marker, every grading project, every polite purchase offer, and every carefully planned improvement had been one quiet whisper leading toward the same inevitable moment. Standing beside my flooded pasture that morning, with the weathered red survey stake resting in the bed of my pickup and Victoria calmly watching from the perfectly dry entrance of Willow Creek Estates, I finally understood that her repeated offers had never been ordinary business negotiations. They had been opportunities to remove the only obstacle standing between her plans and a completed development, and after I refused to sell, someone appeared to believe it would be easier to change the path of the water than the strength of my resolve. The next morning, I stopped looking at the flood as a disaster and started treating it like a question that deserved an honest answer. Before sunrise, I walked the entire eastern boundary of my ranch carrying a notebook, a measuring tape, my camera, and the weathered red survey stake I had pulled from the muddy water. The cool air still carried the smell of damp soil, while a thin layer of mist drifted above the flooded pasture. Every few yards, I stopped to study the ground instead of the water itself. My grandfather once told me that water never creates its own story. It only reveals the story the land has already written. For the first time since the flooding began, I understood exactly what he meant. The deeper I walked into the eastern pasture, the more unusual everything became. Instead of spreading naturally across the fields, the water had carved several narrow channels through healthy grass, each one pointing toward the same corner of my property. Those channels looked too organized to be random. I followed them until they reached the shared boundary with Willow Creek Estates, where freshly disturbed soil met newly landscaped ground on the subdivision side. Tire tracks from heavy construction equipment remained faintly visible beneath drying mud, and several newly planted shrubs lined a gentle slope that I did not remember seeing only months earlier. Standing there, I suddenly realized the entire hillside appeared different. The changes were subtle enough that most people would never notice them, but I had spent my entire life walking these fields. I knew every rise, every shallow depression, and every place where rainwater naturally disappeared after a storm. This land no longer looked the way I remembered. As I continued following the property line, I noticed more bright red survey stakes standing several hundred feet uphill inside the newest phase of the subdivision. They formed a loose line that seemed to follow the exact direction the floodwater had traveled before crossing onto my ranch. I pulled out my phone and compared the scene with photographs I had taken the previous fall while replacing fencing near the same boundary. The difference became impossible to ignore. A natural drainage swale that had always carried runoff toward the creek no longer existed. In its place stood a carefully graded slope leading directly toward my eastern pasture. Decorative stone retaining walls bordered freshly landscaped yards, while a new drainage opening sat quietly beneath one section of the subdivision road. None of those features appeared suspicious by themselves. Together, they painted a very different picture. They suggested that someone had slowly reshaped the landscape one project at a time until stormwater followed an entirely new route. Later that afternoon, I attended a county planning meeting carrying printed photographs, recent measurements, and notes from my morning survey. The officials listened respectfully, accepted copies of everything I brought, and assured me they would review the matter according to established procedures. Across the room, Victoria Ashcroft remained calm, occasionally writing notes without looking in my direction. She never interrupted, never argued, and never appeared concerned. Walking back to my truck beneath the warm Texas sun, I realized something that unsettled me more than the flood itself. If every construction project had received separate approval, then whoever planned this system understood exactly how to change an entire watershed without making any single change appear significant. As I placed the red survey stake back into the bed of my pickup, I no longer believed I was investigating a natural disaster. I believed I was standing at the beginning of a carefully engineered plan that had remained invisible simply because nobody had ever connected all of the pieces together. Over the next several weeks, I learned that silence can be just as frustrating as an argument. Every office I contacted listened politely, accepted my photographs, measurements, and written observations, then assured me that someone would review the information and respond as soon as possible. Days became weeks, and every reply sounded almost identical. The county engineering department explained that the visible construction appeared to match approved permits. The drainage office stated that additional evaluation might be necessary if new evidence became available. Even my insurance adjuster admitted the flooding looked unusual, but reminded me that determining responsibility fell outside the scope of the policy. None of those conversations proved anyone was ignoring the problem. They simply left me standing exactly where I had started, surrounded by damaged pasture and unanswered questions. Meanwhile, life on the ranch refused to slow down. The floodwater gradually retreated, leaving behind thick layers of silt across fields that should have been covered with healthy grazing grass. Several fence posts leaned where the current had pushed against them for hours, and sections of gravel road leading toward the eastern pasture had washed into shallow ruts that required immediate repair. Every sunrise began with feeding livestock, checking water lines, repairing damaged fencing, and documenting every visible change before another afternoon storm could erase fresh evidence. Each evening ended with another folder of photographs added to the growing stack inside my office. The land still depended on me, even while the paperwork moved at its own pace. Then another certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. I recognized the return address before I even opened it. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was another purchase proposal written in the same courteous language as every previous offer. This time the letter acknowledged the recent flooding and suggested that selling the ranch might provide an opportunity to move forward without additional financial uncertainty. The proposed amount exceeded every previous offer by a considerable margin, but the timing immediately caught my attention. It did not read like a coincidence. It read like confidence. Someone believed the flood had finally placed enough pressure on me to change my answer. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside every earlier offer inside my filing cabinet. Looking at the growing stack, I realized those letters represented far more than failed business negotiations. They formed a timeline that stretched back years, each offer arriving as the subdivision expanded closer to my eastern boundary. A few days later, I met with an experienced property attorney who specialized in land use disputes throughout Texas. I spread maps, photographs, county correspondence, engineering notes, and every purchase offer across the conference table while explaining everything from the first visit by Victoria Ashcroft to the strange path the floodwater had taken across my ranch. He listened without interrupting until every document had been reviewed. Finally, he closed the last folder and looked directly at me. He told me the pattern deserved serious attention, but suspicion alone would never convince a court. We would need technical evidence, historical documentation, and expert analysis capable of showing exactly how the drainage system had changed over time. Driving home beneath a wide Texas sunset, I realized he had given me something far more valuable than reassurance. He had given me a direction. That evening, as I walked into the equipment barn, my eyes settled once again on the weathered red survey stake leaning quietly against the wall. For the first time, I no longer saw it as debris carried by muddy water. I saw the beginning of a trail that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to follow it all the way back to where the story truly began. The breakthrough did not arrive because I was smarter than everyone else. It arrived because my father had never believed in throwing anything away. Early the next morning, I unlocked the old equipment shed behind the barn and walked toward a dented gray filing cabinet that had not been opened in years. Dust covered every drawer, and the metal handles protested as I pulled them open one by one. Most folders contained ordinary ranch records, cattle inventories, tax documents, and equipment manuals dating back decades. Then I found a thick envelope labeled Eastern Watershed Survey in my father's careful handwriting. I carried it onto the porch, unfolded the oversized engineering maps across the weathered wooden table, and immediately recognized the landscape exactly as it had existed long before Willow Creek Estates was ever built. Every natural drainage swale, seasonal creek, elevation point, and runoff path had been surveyed with remarkable precision. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and age, but every line remained perfectly readable. I opened my laptop beside the maps and compared them with recent aerial photographs available through the county mapping system. Within minutes, differences began appearing everywhere. Several natural drainage channels shown on the original survey no longer existed. Decorative retention ponds occupied areas that had once collected runoff naturally. Fresh grading had altered gentle slopes that previously directed water harmlessly toward the creek. Most importantly, a newly engineered drainage corridor now pointed directly toward the eastern corner of my ranch where the flooding had first appeared. Inside the same envelope, I discovered several pages of handwritten notes my father had taken during county planning meetings years earlier. One sentence had been circled twice with blue ink. Never allow redirected runoff across the eastern pasture. I stared at those words for several seconds because they described the exact problem standing outside my window. That afternoon, my attorney recommended bringing in an independent civil engineer whose work had been accepted in courts throughout Texas. 2 days later, Daniel Mercer arrived carrying surveying equipment, laser measuring instruments, and copies of the historical watershed maps. Unlike everyone else I had spoken with, Daniel made no assumptions and offered no early conclusions. He spent hours walking the entire eastern boundary, recording elevations, inspecting culverts, measuring drainage openings, and comparing the original watershed survey with the present terrain. Late in the afternoon, we reached a gently sloping section beside the subdivision where several faded red survey stakes still remained partially buried beneath new grass. Daniel knelt beside one of them, carefully brushed away the dirt, and compared the remaining markings with archived survey field notes that matched the original engineering records. After several quiet moments, he stood and looked directly at me. "Marcus, this marker belongs to the original drainage survey. It marks a location that should not exist within the current grading plan if the natural watershed had been preserved." He explained that stormwater always follows gravity, but gravity follows the landscape people create. Change the elevation only a few inches across enough distance, and thousands of gallons of runoff will choose an entirely different destination. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle aligned with unsettling clarity. The repeated purchase offers, the quiet construction projects, the disappearing drainage swales, the decorative improvements, and the flood itself no longer appeared unrelated. They formed one continuous sequence leading toward the same outcome. As I picked up the weathered red survey stake once again, I realized it had never simply drifted onto my ranch by chance. It had carried the first physical clue proving that someone had quietly rewritten the land itself. And from that moment forward, the evidence finally began telling the story that the flood had started. Daniel Mercer had given us the missing technical explanation, but one engineering opinion alone was never going to persuade a judge. If I wanted to protect my family's ranch, I needed evidence so thorough that every document supported the next until the entire story became impossible to challenge. My attorney advised me not to confront Victoria Ashcroft or anyone associated with Willow Creek Estates. Instead, he told me to let the evidence grow quietly while everyone else continued believing the flood had simply been another unfortunate storm. It was difficult advice to follow, but I understood the wisdom behind it. Every morning before sunrise, I launched a small drone from the western pasture and flew the exact same route along the eastern property line. After every rainfall, whether it measured half an inch or several inches, I recorded how the runoff traveled from the subdivision toward my ranch. Week after week, the recordings showed the same pattern. Water flowed around decorative ponds, followed newly graded slopes, entered the engineered drainage corridor, and crossed directly into the same section of my eastern pasture before spreading across grazing land that had remained dry for decades. Nature changes from one storm to another, but engineered systems repeat themselves with remarkable consistency. Daniel continued conducting detailed elevation surveys while I installed weather-resistant cameras overlooking the shared property line. The cameras operated day and night without interruption, preserving details that no witness could accurately remember months later. We also requested historical aerial photographs, archived grading permits, engineering revisions, inspection reports, and construction records from county offices. At first, each document appeared ordinary when reviewed by itself. However, once my attorney arranged everything across the conference room wall in chronological order, an unmistakable pattern emerged. Every grading revision corresponded with another phase of subdivision construction. Every construction phase gradually altered natural drainage. Every alteration moved runoff a little farther toward my ranch. Every purchase offer from the Homeowners Association arrived after another major stage of development had been completed, Individually, none of those events proved misconduct. Together, they described a carefully organized sequence that stretched across several years. During that same period, another purchase inquiry arrived, this time through a commercial real estate firm representing an unnamed buyer. The offer was higher than every previous proposal and promised a fast closing without complicated negotiations. I thanked the representative for the interest and politely declined without mentioning a single piece of the evidence we had collected. My attorney smiled after hearing about the conversation because he believed silence had become one of our strongest advantages. The more confident the other side remained, the less likely anyone would realize how completely the investigation had progressed. Several days later, Daniel spread the original watershed survey beside the latest drone imagery on the conference table. Without speaking, he traced the historical drainage path with one finger before following the new engineered route with the other. Only a few feet separated the two lines in several locations, yet those few feet redirected thousands of gallons of stormwater away from Willow Creek Estates and into my pasture. Looking at those maps, I finally understood why my father preserved every survey, every meeting note, and every engineering record instead of throwing them away. He believed the land remembered every decision people made upon it. As I closed the final evidence binder and secured the weathered red survey stake inside the same box, I realized we were no longer trying to prove that my ranch had flooded. We were preparing to prove that someone had patiently redesigned where the water would go. And for the first time since the flood began, I felt certain that the truth was finally strong enough to speak entirely for itself. The courthouse was quieter than I expected, and somehow that made the day feel even more important. Months of investigation had transformed one unexplained flood into a carefully documented chain of engineering decisions supported by historical surveys, aerial photographs, drone recordings, elevation studies, county records, construction permits, weather reports, and expert analysis. Every page inside our evidence binders represented another step in a story that had begun with muddy water crossing my eastern pasture. My attorney reminded me one final time that courtrooms are rarely won by the loudest voice. They are won by the clearest evidence. Across the room, Victoria Ashcroft sat beside the attorneys representing the Homeowners Association. She looked as composed as she always had during every neighborhood meeting, every purchase negotiation, and every county hearing. If she felt any concern, she did not show it. When the proceedings began, the Homeowners Association argued that an unusually severe storm had overwhelmed regional drainage systems and insisted every construction project inside Willow Creek Estates had been completed according to approved permits and county inspections. Standing alone, each statement sounded reasonable. Then our presentation began. Daniel Mercer explained the original watershed survey prepared decades before the subdivision existed and demonstrated how the natural drainage system had protected my ranch for generations. Using engineering diagrams and elevation models, he carefully illustrated how multiple grading revisions gradually redirected runoff away from the subdivision and toward my eastern pasture. Next came the historical aerial photographs placed beside current satellite imagery, allowing the court to compare the landscape before and after years of development. Natural drainage swales had disappeared. Decorative retaining walls and newly graded slopes occupied their place. The drone recordings followed, showing rainfall after rainfall producing the same predictable flow pattern into my ranch. Weather records confirmed that the storm itself was significant but not extraordinary when compared with previous years. County documents established the timeline for every grading revision, construction phase, and inspection. Each exhibit strengthened the one before it until the individual pieces formed one continuous picture. Finally, my attorney presented the weathered red survey stake. Daniel compared its remaining survey markings with archived field notes preserved from the original engineering project and explained how the marker identified a location within the historic drainage design before later grading altered the watershed. What had appeared to be an insignificant piece of wood became physical evidence connecting the original landscape with the changes that followed. During cross-examination, several engineering witnesses acknowledged that while each grading modification appeared minor when evaluated independently, the cumulative effect substantially redirected stormwater beyond its natural drainage basin. The judge listened carefully, asking detailed questions about watershed calculations, permit reviews, cumulative engineering impacts, and whether the long-term drainage consequences had ever been evaluated as one complete system rather than isolated construction projects. Hour after hour, no dramatic confrontation unfolded inside the courtroom. The evidence simply continued speaking with calm consistency until speculation gave way to documented fact. For the first time since I had watched muddy water spread across my family's pasture, I looked toward Victoria without anger. Her confidence had gradually faded as every map, photograph, survey, and engineering report connected another piece of the story. The flood that someone expected to pressure me into selling my family's ranch had instead carried the first clue onto my land. And by the time the final exhibit was admitted into evidence, I realized the water itself had become the most reliable witness anyone could have asked for. Several weeks passed before the court issued its final decision, and those weeks felt longer than the entire investigation. I returned to the ranch every evening after meeting with my attorney, walking the eastern pasture where muddy floodwater had once covered healthy, grazing land. Fresh green grass had slowly begun pushing through the layers of dried silt. Fence repairs were nearly complete, and the familiar sounds of cattle moving across the fields once again filled the quiet Texas mornings. Standing beneath the same oak trees my grandfather planted decades earlier, I realized that no amount of money could restore the time my family had spent rebuilding what should never have been damaged. Still, I believed something even more important had already been restored. The truth had finally been given the opportunity to stand on its own. When the court reconvened, the courtroom remained completely silent as the judge carefully reviewed the findings. He explained that the dispute was never about preventing responsible development or stopping a neighborhood from growing. The issue before the court concerned accountability. Property owners, developers, and homeowners associations all carried a legal responsibility to ensure that engineered improvements did not unlawfully transfer damage onto neighboring land. After reviewing the engineering testimony, historical watershed surveys, construction records, aerial imagery, drone documentation, weather data, and expert analysis, the court concluded that the cumulative grading modifications had redirected stormwater beyond its natural drainage path, causing foreseeable and substantial damage to my ranch. The judge further determined that the evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of engineering changes whose combined effects had not been properly evaluated before construction proceeded. The court awarded $13 million in compensatory damages, restoration costs, and punitive damages. In addition, the court ordered the responsible parties to restore the original drainage system under independent engineering supervision and remove the existing homeowners association board from office, directing that future governance proceed under court-ordered oversight until new leadership could be properly established. For several long seconds, nobody inside the courtroom spoke. I closed my eyes and thought about my grandfather clearing mesquite by hand, my father teaching me how to repair fences after every storm, and the promise I made to myself years earlier that this land would remain in our family for as long as I had the strength to protect it. The financial judgment was significant, but it had never been the reason I refused to sell. Some things cannot be measured by market value because they were never built for profit. Restoration work began several months later. Independent engineers supervised the removal of drainage barriers, reopened the original watershed channels identified on my father's survey maps, and carefully restored the eastern pasture using native grasses and natural contours that had protected the ranch for generations. During the first major storm after every repair had been completed, I stood beneath the covered porch holding a warm cup of coffee as steady rains swept across the valley. This time the water followed the route nature had always intended, flowing peacefully toward the creek instead of racing across my fields. My ranch remained exactly as it should have been. Before walking back inside, I carried the weathered red survey stake into my father's old equipment shed and placed it beside the original watershed maps that had helped uncover the truth. It was no longer just a forgotten survey marker. It had become a reminder that patience outlasts intimidation, evidence outlasts deception, and no matter how carefully someone tries to rewrite the land, the truth will always find its way home, just like the water.